I want to thank you for joining me today. I'm Carol Costello. Of course, we're just minutes away from President Obama and his unveiling of new limits on NSA surveillance. We're going to carry that announcement live for you. So I want to hand it over to WOlf Blitzer in Washington to start our special coverage. Take it away, Wolf.
Thanks very much. And we want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. I'm WOlf Blitzer here in Washington. We have important news we're following right now. We've got all of our reporters standing by. This is an important day here in the nation's capital because the President of the United States, only moments from now, is about to deliver a major speech on privacy, diplomacy, politics, and technology, most of all on national security. 6 months after Edward Snowden shocked the world with the secrets he exposed on U.S. government surveillance, President Obama is now unveiling reforms aimed at 4 key audiences: the U.S. intelligence community, a vocal and bipartisan coalition of privacy defenders in Congress, foreign leaders who found themselves the subject of NSA surveillance, and technology companies who feel pressured, compromised, and violated by U.S. demands. A senior administration official says this morning that the president plans to require the NSA to get approval from the Secret Intelligence Court to access what is called metadata on Americans' telephone calls. That information about the calls, the numbers, the times, the durations, but not the content of the calls. At some point, the president will require that that data be transferred out of government hands. I want to bring in our chief national security correspondent, Jim Sciutto. He's standing by. Our senior White House correspondent, Jim Acosta. Our chief political analyst, Gloria Borger. We're awaiting the president. Jim Acosta, he's over at the Justice Department. That's where he's delivering these remarks. Explain why he selected the Justice Department to deliver important reform proposals to NSA surveillance.
A couple of reasons why, Wolf. The president wants to send 2 messages, and one is about law and order and national security. The president, I think, in addition to these reforms he's going to lay out, is also going to present a stout defense of these programs in terms of what they do for the American people, that they do provide national security for the United States, not only to Americans domestically, but around the world, that these programs are also necessary to protect U.S. allies. So I think you're going to hear the president talk about that, but he's also, in addition to that, Wolf, going to talk about how technology is advancing so quickly, and we've seen that in these disclosures from Edward Snowden, that it is now time for reform. And that is why the president is moving forward with these proposals that he's going to lay out in a few minutes over at the Justice Department. The other reason why he's at the Justice Department is because he wants to tip his hat to these privacy concerns that you just talked about. The administration has been telling us for several days now that the president believes that a part of a national security is that people feel secure in terms of their own privacy. So I think you're going to hear a nod to that as well. And Wolf, as you mentioned, these reforms that the president is going to talk about, yes, he is going to talk about the need to store that bulk phone metadata at an outside of government location. The question at this point, Wolf, and it'll be interesting to hear just how the president addresses this, is where that data is going to be held. Because at this point, the phone companies, the carriers have been saying, we don't want that data. We don't want to have the liability for holding that data. And so the government is going to basically have to engage in this review process where the president's going to take input from the Attorney General, the intelligence community, also Congress, as to where that collection will be held. And for now, that means for all practical matters that this data is going to stay at the National Security Agency. The other very important part of all of this, when the NSA wants to access that data, and keep in mind, they're going to continue to collect that data, when they want to access that data, they're going to have to go to that federal surveillance court. That is another big part of these reforms. That is something that did not exist before. Wolf. Yeah, and the president basically has until the end of March to go ahead and find out where that data will be stored. Jim Sciutto, you're watching what's going on. Are the reforms the president's expected to announce today likely to satisfy those critics like Edward Snowden, for example?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, clearly these reforms are a bit more aggressive than I think some people watching this, and it's my information they were debating some of these key issues right up into the final hours. It shows you the sensitivity of them. And as you look at them, it does appear the president is accepting the 2 most significant recommendations from his own intelligence reform panel. One of them was to have judicial review for these searches. Senior administration officials have indicated he's going to do that. 2, they recommended moving that data out of government hands. The trouble is he's punted on the most difficult question there, which is where do you then put it? Because, as Jim noted, telephone companies don't want it. Do you create a third entity? That's going to be a difficult question to answer. And a final thing, just for our viewers out there, at the end of the day, this metadata will still be collected. and the NSA will still have access to it. They're going to have to go through more safeguards. They're going to have to get judicial review, but when needed, when they determine that there's a national security interest, they're still going to be able to do that. And I think that's just something that needs to be made clear, that, you know, it's a change, it's a step forward, but will that satisfy some of the most severe critics? I don't think so.
We've seen a significant shift in the president, I think, over these past many years. One stance he had, very concerned about privacy violations when he was a United States Senator from Illinois. Then when the Snowden leaks emerged, 6 months ago, very protective, very defensive, saying everything was done legal. This is necessary to protect America, to avoid another 9/11. And now, over the past 6 months, shifting a little bit more, saying, you know, there has to be some greater privacy protections.
Well, you know, presidents evolve, as Barack Obama himself might say. And if you watch the evolution of candidate Obama, even as a Senate candidate, this is somebody who was fiercely idealistic, protective of your privacy. And now, in one way or another, he is governing a surveillance state, you know, for a better word. And he is looking here in these proposals that Jim has been talking about. He is looking for a way to thread the needle. So he can say, look, I'm not snooping on your phone calls, and I guarantee you he's going to talk about that today. I am not snooping on your phone calls, but I need to keep this country safe. And it occurs when you move into that Oval Office, and every morning when you wake up and you're behind that desk and that director of the Central Intelligence Agency comes to you with the threat matrix and you see what people are trying to do to this country, it tends to change you. And I think we've seen that shift in the president, but he also remains the constitutional scholar who doesn't want to intrude on your privacy. So he's trying to find this balance between national security and privacy, and I think he's having a rough time, and I think his administration is having a rough time in trying to figure out how to do this itself.
I think it's fair. I'll be surprised if he satisfies everyone. The critics on the left will be upset still. The critics on the right will still be upset.
Or even inside his own administration, Wolf, there's disagreement.
He's trying to walk that fine line. James Spider-Marks is here, retired U.S. Army General, CNN military analyst. From your perspective, based on what we know, and we have the rough outlines of what the president's going to say, he'll fill in the blanks with some of the details. Is this an acceptable compromise, shall we say, even though it's not going to satisfy the critics on the right or the left?
It's acceptable if it can work. Clearly, the president has laid down some markers here, and the Congress has to get on board, and we've seen the dysfunction of this Congress. Let's call it like it is. It's easy to punt this thing down the road, so the president looks very presidential, if you'll allow me that. He can come up, very magnanimous. We need to make some changes and swift kind of move this thing over to the other side a little bit. But the Congress is going to have to get on board, and so the president can have it both ways. We can maintain data collection, which, as we've discussed, will always be in place. Every keystroke is captured, so that exists. So it's our ability, our intelligence community's ability, specifically NSA charged with this, to go after that. How that will occur, in the interim, there will be no changes. So I don't know that there's really a compromise. There will be no change.
The end of March.
There will be no changes.
Right.
And beyond that, Wolf, I have very little belief that anything is really substantively going to change in order for our abilities to go after data as necessary. Now, without getting into too much of the arcana of how this all works, but once you get into networks, you can have 2-hop networks. I talked to Gloria. Who does Gloria talk to? That's the second hop. That's good, but I can't go after those guys that they talk to. Well, let's see how that really works. So where that data exists, where it ultimately will exist, is the big question right now.
Nobody wants to hold it, right?
Oh, absolutely. As you've indicated, it's the hot potato. Where is this going to be? The providers don't want to hold it because they want to make room for more. I mean, this is an incredibly dynamic cell environment that we're talking about here.
And it's interesting because he has to make this case not only to the American people, but to the international foreign leaders and foreign public, right? There are
well, how far will he go in the speech today, based on what we know, in assuring Angela Merkel and other friendly leaders the U.S. is not going to eavesdrop, listen in on their private phone conversations on their cell phones?
I've been told that they've decided for some time that they're going to set limits, severe limits on spying spying on foreign leaders. The president's determined that it's just not worth it, frankly, and that the damage done is too great to justify any, fringe benefit from doing that kind of monitoring. I'm also told that the moment that really made a difference was the Angela Merkel moment. That they have a particularly close personal relationship. Germany is an extremely close ally in terms of national security issues, economic issues. When that blew up, the Obama White House says we really have to do something, and I think you're going to see some real limits placed on foreign leaders.
Let me go to the White House. Jim Acosta, you're standing by, and to just sort of recap, we're waiting for the president. He's going to go to the microphone there at the Justice Department, announce the reforms that he's accepted as far as NSA surveillance is concerned, and where we're moving forward, where the United States will be on this very, very sensitive issue. Do we expect the president specifically to acknowledge in this address that the United States over the years has eavesdropped, has listened in on phone conversations of world leaders, especially allied world leaders?
Well, I think the White House has just about acknowledged that without saying it explicitly, Wolf. And I think when the president goes out there and says that we're going to be curtailing that surveillance activity, that is in and of itself an acknowledgement that they have been spying on world leaders. And just for all intents and purposes, we can report they have been doing that. But to get to Jim's point, this has been an embarrassment, not only in Europe, but across Latin America, Brazil. Leaders in Mexico, across the globe have been very upset with this White House because of that surveillance program on heads of state, as they call them here. But one thing that we should also mention, Wolf, that we haven't talked about so far, is that the president is also expected to announce a privacy advocate to the surveillance court, something that also did not exist before today. And from what I understand from talking to administration officials, a lot of these changes are going to happen effective immediately. So, for example, the requirement that the NSA has to go to the federal surveillance court in order to access the metadata archives and collection systems. That goes into effect effective immediately, according to administration officials. And as for this privacy advocate, that is something that did not exist before. But again, just like the storage of the data being outside of government hands, the details have not been worked out yet. Who are these privacy advocates going to be? How is it that they're going to operate before the surveillance court? Is it sort of like having a defense attorney for people's privacy concerns? That is likely not to be the case. And keep in mind, some people have been saying, well, this is sort of glossing over and punting and that sort of thing. Keep in mind that the federal surveillance court judges sent a letter to Dianne Feinstein, the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, just recently saying, hey, don't put a privacy advocate on the court. Don't do some of these changes that you're talking about. So what the president is going to outline does go beyond what the surveillance court wants in many cases, Wolf.
All right, hold on, everyone, hold on. We're standing by to hear directly from the president. I'm curious, will the president mention the name Edward Snowden when he speaks to the world in just a few minutes? It's clear to all of us that if Edward Snowden had not leaked all this sensitive information, the president probably would not be unveiling these reforms today, for good or for bad. We'll hear what he says if he mentions that name, Edward Snowden. Much more of our special coverage right after this. Back to our special coverage. The President of the United States about to announce some major changes in intelligence reform, surveillance reform. The NSA program under a lot of criticism from the far left, the far right, some folks in the middle as well. So the President's coming forward today with a series of changes. How far he goes, we'll find out pretty soon. Bob Baer is a CNN national security intelligence analyst, former officer, case officer over at the CIA. What do you think about all these changes? We got the rough outlines. Bob, is he going far enough, going too far? What's your assessment?
Wolf, I think he's doing absolutely right. We need warrants based on probable cause to get into metadata. We cannot get rid of the metadata. Someone has to keep it. It's the way that 9/11 was cracked so quickly, was the FBI got into the metadata. A lot of cases, after an attack or crime has occurred, you have to have this stuff available. You can't get rid of it. Number two, we may say we're not going to spy on the Germans, on Merkel and the rest of it. That's fine. It sounds good. But at the end of the day, we have to listen to German telephones because, remember, 9/11 was hatched in Germany. So I think the president's making the right, all the right decisions. I don't necessarily trust the NSA and the FBI. So put them under a FISA court.
And we see the FBI director walking in, sitting down, the attorney general. They're all there getting ready to hear the president. When they walk in, the FBI director and the attorney general, you know the president will be following shortly. This whole notion, Bob, and as we expect the president to be speaking momentarily, this whole notion of spying on foreign leaders, spying, if you will, on the American public, the surveillance. When we hear the phrase metadata, what exactly does that mean in a practical terms when you're talking about preventing another 9/11, because it's a complicated system that they have there.
Well, it's really based on link analysis. I worked for the Special Tribunal in The Hague investigating the Hariri murder, and after he was
Hariri murder
killed,
in Lebanon,
the prime minister, yes, in Lebanon, and we got in the telephone data and went through it and pieced together, and only thanks to these telephone calls, the records of them, who killed Hariri, and it was a group inside Hezbollah, and without that stuff we would have never made the case. I can't, you know, I believe in privacy too, but you need to keep these records around. They're great for after the fact. They don't do much for you to predict a crime, but after, absolutely.
So if the NSA is not going to keep all these records, and the private phone companies aren't going to keep these records, where are these records going to be kept?
You know, under some sort of a judicial authority, you know, whether you put it out in Utah in this NSA place or it doesn't matter where, you just need to have a record of who gets into the databases and under what authority. And it has to be under judicial authority, again, probable cause, and without that, we just don't want the FBI or the CIA snooping around these records on fishing expeditions. But with a warrant, I think it's justified.
Because as you know, and I'm going to bring Jim Sciutto into this conversation, a lot of folks have criticized the FISA courts, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act courts, because they've almost always been a rubber stamp. The administration says, we need to go listen in, we need a wiretap, and they say, okay, do it. You can count on one hand the times that they've said it's not a good idea. By adding a public advocate to that process, you get to hear a different side of the story, and it may not necessarily continue to be that so-called rubber stamp.
It makes it a real court, right? I mean, what other court in the country only has one side represented? So you need to have the other side. It frankly wouldn't be balanced. You'll have the prosecutors, you'll have the judge, but it does give you at least an adversarial process, which is a bedrock of the way we do things in this country. And I think when you look at the numbers of the FISA court, I mean, they tend to approve 99.9% of these requests as it is. Putting an advocate in there at least gives another argument, but I can't imagine that's going to change that dynamic too much, because at the end of the day they don't actually come with as many requests, I think, as Americans imagine. That those queries tend to have the backing that you need, but at least by putting in this process, having a public advocate, it will increase confidence. And what administration officials have said repeatedly, a lot of this is about building confidence. That there's an impression out there that this is a mass domestic spying program, a mass foreign spying program, and they want to get across that that's not the case.
But one man's safeguards is another man's roadblock, right? Yeah. And so the FISA court would argue that they actually do consider both sides in every decision that they make. So if you add in another advocate and another side.
Here he is. The president is now at the Justice Department getting a little bit of a standing ovation before his remarks. Let's listen in.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Please have a seat. At the dawn of our republic, a small secret surveillance committee born out of the Sons of Liberty was established in Boston. And the group's members included Paul Revere. At night, they would patrol the streets, reporting back any signs that the British were preparing raids against America's early patriots. Throughout American history, intelligence has helped secure our country and our freedoms. In the Civil War, Union balloons reconnaissance tracked the size of Confederate armies by counting the number of campfires. In World War II, code breakers gave us insights into Japanese war plans. And when Patton marched across Europe, intercepted communications helped save the lives of his troops. After the war, the rise of the Iron Curtain and nuclear weapons only increased the need for sustained intelligence gathering. And so, in the early days of the Cold War, President Truman created the National Security Agency, or NSA, to give us insights into the Soviet bloc and provide our leaders with information they needed to confront aggression and avert catastrophe. Throughout this evolution, we benefited from both our Constitution and our traditions of limited government. U.S. intelligence agencies were anchored in a system of checks and balances, with oversight from elected leaders and protections for ordinary citizens. Meanwhile, totalitarian states like East Germany offered a cautionary tale of what could happen when vast, unchecked surveillance turned citizens into informers and persecuted people for what they said in the privacy of their own homes. In fact, even the United States proved not to be immune to the abuse of surveillance. In the 1960s, government spied on civil rights leaders and critics of the Vietnam War. And partly in response to these revelations, additional laws were established in the 1970s to ensure that our intelligence capabilities could not be misused against our citizens. In the long twilight struggle, again, we had been reminded that the very liberties that we sought to preserve could not be sacrificed at the altar of national security. Now, if the fall of the Soviet Union left America without a competing superpower, emerging threats from terrorist groups and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction place new and in some ways more complicated demands on our intelligence agencies. Globalization and the internet made these threats more acute as technology erased borders and empowered individuals to project great violence as well as great good. Moreover, these new threats raised new legal and new policy questions. For while few doubted the legitimacy of spying on hostile states, our framework of laws was not fully adapted to prevent terrorist attacks by individuals acting on their own or acting in small ideologically driven groups on behalf of a foreign power. The horror of September 11th brought all these issues to the fore. Across the political spectrum, Americans recognized that we had to adapt to a world in which a bomb could be built in a basement and our electric grid could be shut down by operators an ocean away. We were shaken by the signs we had missed leading up to the attacks. How the hijackers had made phone calls to known extremists and traveled to suspicious places. So we demanded that our intelligence community improve its capabilities and that law enforcement change practices to focus more on preventing attacks before they happen than prosecuting terrorists after an attack. It is hard to overstate the transformation America's intelligence community had to go through after 9/11. Our agencies suddenly needed to do far more than the traditional mission of monitoring hostile powers and gathering information for policymakers. Instead, they were now asked to identify and target plotters in some of the most remote parts of the world and to anticipate the actions of networks that by their very nature could not be easily penetrated with spies or informants. And it is a testimony to the hard work and dedication of the men and women of our intelligence community that over the past decade, we've made enormous strides in fulfilling this mission. Today, new capabilities allow intelligence agencies to track who a terrorist is in contact with and follow the trail of his travel or his funding. New laws allow information to be collected and shared more quickly and effectively between federal agencies and state and local law enforcement. Relationships with foreign intelligence services have expanded, and our capacity to repel cyber attacks have been strengthened. And taken together, these efforts have prevented multiple attacks and saved innocent lives, not just here in the United States, but around the globe. And yet, in our rush to respond to a very real and novel set of threats, the risk of government overreach, the possibility that we lose some of our core liberties in pursuit of security also became more pronounced. We saw in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, our government engaged in enhanced interrogation techniques that contradicted our values. As a senator, I was critical of several practices, such as warrantless wiretaps. And all too often, new authorities were instituted without adequate public debate. Through a combination of action by the courts, increased congressional oversight, and adjustments by the previous administration, some of the worst excesses that emerged after 9/11 were curbed by the time I took office. But a variety of factors have continued to complicate America's efforts to both defend our nation and uphold our civil liberties. First, the same technological advances that allow U.S. intelligence agencies to pinpoint an al-Qaeda cell in Yemen or an email between two terrorists in the Sahel also mean that many routine communications around the world are within our reach. And at a time when more and more of our lives are digital, that prospect is disquieting for all of us. Second, the combination of increased digital information and powerful supercomputers offers intelligence agencies the possibility of sifting through massive amounts of bulk data to identify patterns or pursue leads that may thwart impending threats. It's a powerful tool. But the government collection and storage of such bulk data also creates a potential for abuse. Third, the legal safeguards that restrict surveillance against U.S. persons without a warrant do not apply to foreign persons overseas. This is not unique to America. Few, if any, spy agencies around the world constrain their activities beyond their own borders. And the whole point of intelligence is to obtain information that is not publicly available. But America's capabilities are unique. And the power of new technologies means that there are fewer and fewer technical constraints on what we can do. That places a special obligation on us to ask tough questions about what we should do. And finally, intelligence agencies cannot function without secrecy, which makes their work less subject to public debate. Yet there is an inevitable bias, not only within the intelligence community, but among all of us who are responsible for national security, to collect more information about the world, not less. So in the absence of institutional requirements for regular debate and oversight that is public as well as private or classified, the danger of government overreach becomes more acute. And this is particularly true when surveillance technology and our reliance on digital information is evolving much faster than our laws. For all these reasons, I maintained a healthy skepticism toward our surveillance programs after I became president. I ordered that our programs be reviewed by my national security team and our lawyers. And in some cases, I ordered changes in how we did business. We increased oversight and auditing, including new structures aimed at compliance. Improved rules were proposed by the government and approved by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And we sought to keep Congress continually updated on these activities. What I did not do is stop these programs wholesale. Not only because I felt that they made us more secure, but also because nothing in that initial review and nothing that I've learned since indicated that our intelligence community has sought to violate the law or is cavalier about the civil liberties of their fellow citizens. To the contrary, in an extraordinarily difficult job, one in which actions are second-guessed, success is unreported, and failure can be catastrophic, the men and women of the intelligence community, including the NSA, consistently follow protocols designed to protect the privacy of ordinary people. They're not abusing authorities in order to listen to your private phone calls or read your emails. When mistakes are made, which is inevitable in any large and complicated human enterprise, they correct those mistakes. Laboring in obscurity, often unable to discuss their work even with family and friends, the men and women at the NSA know that if another 9/11 or massive cyber attack occurs, they will be asked by Congress and the media why they failed to connect the dots. What sustains those who work at NSA and our other intelligence agencies through all these pressures is the knowledge that their professionalism and dedication play a central role in the defense of our nation. Now, to say that our intelligence community follows the law and is staffed by patriots is not to suggest that I or others in my administration felt complacent about the potential impact of these programs. Those of us who hold office in America have a responsibility to our Constitution. And while I was confident in the integrity of those who lead our intelligence community, it was clear to me in observing our intelligence operations on a regular basis that changes in our technological capabilities were raising new questions about the privacy safeguards currently in place. Moreover, after an extended review of our use of drones in the fight against terrorist networks, I believed a fresh examination of our surveillance programs was a necessary next step in our effort to get off the open-ended war footing that we've maintained since 9/11. And for these reasons, I indicated in a speech at the National Defense University last May that we needed a more robust public discussion about the balance between security and liberty. Of course, what I did not know at the time is that within weeks of my speech, an avalanche of unauthorized disclosures would spark controversies at home and abroad that have continued to this day. Now, given the fact of an open investigation, I'm not going to dwell on Mr. Snowden's actions or his motivations. I will say that our nation's defense depends in part on the fidelity of those entrusted with our nation's secrets. If any individual who objects to government policy can take it into their own hands to publicly disclose classified information, then we will not be able to keep our people safe or conduct foreign policy. Moreover, the sensational way in which these disclosures have come out has often shed more heat than light, while revealing methods to our adversaries that could impact our operations in ways that we may not fully understand for years to come. Regardless of how we got here, though, the task before us now is greater than simply repairing the damage done to our operations or preventing more disclosures from taking place in the future. Instead, we have to make some important decisions about how to protect ourselves and sustain our leadership in the world while upholding the civil liberties and privacy protections that our ideals and our Constitution require. We need to do so not only because it is right, but because the challenges posed by threats like terrorism and proliferation and cyber attacks are not going away anytime soon. They are going to continue to be a major problem. And for our intelligence community to be effective over the long haul, we must maintain the trust of the American people and people around the world. This effort will not be completed overnight. And given the pace of technological change, we shouldn't expect this to be the last time America has this debate. But I want the American people to know that the work has begun. Over the last 6 months, I created an outside review group on intelligence and communications technologies to make recommendations for reform. I consulted with the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, created by Congress. I've listened to foreign partners, privacy advocates, and industry leaders. My administration has spent countless hours considering how to approach intelligence in this era of diffuse threats and technological revolution. So before outlining specific changes that I've ordered, let me make a few broad observations that have emerged from this process. First, everyone who has looked at these problems, including skeptics of existing programs, recognizes that we have real enemies and threats and that intelligence serves a vital role in confronting them. We cannot prevent terrorist attacks or cyber threats without some capability to penetrate digital communications, whether it's to unravel a terrorist plot, to intercept malware that targets a stock exchange, to make sure air traffic control systems are not compromised, or to ensure that hackers do not empty your bank accounts. We are expected to protect the American people. That requires us to have capabilities in this field. Moreover, we cannot unilaterally disarm our intelligence agencies. There's a reason why BlackBerries and iPhones are not allowed in the White House Situation Room. We know that the intelligence services of other countries, including some who feign surprise over the Snowden disclosures, are constantly probing our government and private sector networks and accelerating programs to listen to our conversations and intercept our emails and compromise our systems. We know that. Meanwhile, a number of countries, including some who have loudly criticized the NSA, privately acknowledge that America has special responsibilities as the world's only superpower, that our intelligence capabilities are critical to meeting these responsibilities, and that they themselves have relied on the information we obtain to protect their own people. Second, just as ardent civil libertarians recognize the need for robust intelligence capabilities, those with responsibilities for our national security readily acknowledge the potential for abuse as intelligence capabilities advance and more private information is digitized. After all, the folks at NSA and other intelligence agencies are our neighbors. They're our friends and family. They've got electronic bank and medical records like everybody else. They have kids on Facebook and Instagram, and they know more than most of us the vulnerabilities to privacy that exist in a world where transactions are recorded and email and text and messages are stored, and even our movements can increasingly be tracked through the GPS on our phones. Third, there was a recognition by all who participated in these reviews that the challenges to our privacy do not come from government alone. Corporations of all shapes and sizes track what you buy, store and analyze our data, and use it for commercial purposes. That's how those targeted ads pop up on your computer and your smartphone periodically. But all of us understand that the standards for government surveillance must be higher. Given the unique power of the state, it is not enough for leaders to say, trust us, we won't abuse the data we collect. For history has too many examples when that trust has been breached. Our system of government is built on the premise that our liberty cannot depend on the good intentions of those in power. It depends on the law to constrain those in power. I make these observations to underscore that the basic values of most Americans when it comes to questions of surveillance and privacy converge a lot more than the crude characterizations that have emerged over the last several months. Those who are troubled by our existing programs are not interested in repeating the tragedy of 9/11. And those who defend these programs are not dismissive of civil liberties. The challenge is getting the details right, and that is not simple. In fact, during the course of our review, I've often reminded myself I would not be where I am today were it not for the courage of dissidents like Dr. King, who were spied upon by their own government. And as president, a president who looks at intelligence every morning, I also can't help but be reminded that America must be vigilant in the face of threats. Now, fortunately, by focusing on facts and specifics rather than speculation and hypotheticals, this review process has given me, and hopefully the American people, some clear direction for change. And today I can announce a series of concrete and substantial reforms that my administration intends to adopt administratively or will seek to codify with Congress. First, I have approved a new presidential directive for our signals intelligence activities, both at home and abroad. This guidance will strengthen executive branch oversight of our intelligence activities. It will ensure that we take into account our security requirements, but also our alliances, our trade and investment relationships, including the concerns of American companies, and our commitment to privacy and basic liberties. And we will review decisions about intelligence priorities and sensitive targets on an annual basis so that our actions are regularly scrutinized by my senior national security team. Second, we will reform programs and procedures in place to provide greater transparency to our surveillance activities and fortify the safeguards that protect the privacy of U.S. persons. Since we began this review, including information being released today, we've declassified over 40 opinions and orders of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which provides judicial review of some of our most sensitive intelligence activities, including the Section 702 program targeting foreign individuals overseas and the Section 215 telephone metadata program. And going forward, I'm directing the Director of National Intelligence, in consultation with the Attorney General, to annually review, for the purposes of declassification, any future opinions of the court with broad privacy implications, and to report to me and to Congress on these efforts. To ensure that the court hears a broader range of privacy perspectives, I'm also calling on Congress to authorize the establishment of a panel of advocates from outside government to provide an independent voice in significant cases before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Third, we will provide additional protections for activities conducted under Section 702, which allows the government to intercept the communications of foreign targets overseas who have information that's important for our national security. Specifically, I'm asking the Attorney General and DNI to institute reforms that place additional restrictions on government's ability to retain, search, and use in criminal cases communications between Americans and foreign citizens incidentally collected under Section 702. Fourth, in investigating threats, the FBI also relies on what's called national security letters, which can require companies to provide specific and limited information to the government without disclosing the orders to the subject of the investigation. Now, these are cases in which it's important that the subject of the investigation, such as a possible terrorist or spy, isn't tipped off. But we can and should be more transparent in how government uses this authority. I've therefore directed the Attorney General to amend how we use national security letters so that this secrecy will not be indefinite, so that it will terminate within a fixed time unless the government demonstrates a real need for further secrecy. We will also enable communications providers to make public more information than ever before about the orders that they have received to provide data to the government. This brings me to the program that has generated the most controversy these past few months: the bulk collection of telephone records under Section 215. Let me repeat what I said when this story first broke. This program does not involve the content of phone calls or the names of people making calls. Instead, it provides a record of phone numbers and the times and lengths of calls. Metadata that can be queried if and when we have a reasonable suspicion that a particular number is linked to a terrorist organization. Why is this necessary? The program grew out of a desire to address a gap identified after 9/11. One of the 9/11 hijackers, Khalid al-Mindar, made a phone call from San Diego to a known al-Qaeda safe house in Yemen. NSA saw that call, but it could not see that the call was coming from an individual already in the United States. The telephone metadata program under Section 215 was designed to map the communications of terrorists so we can see who they may be in contact with as quickly as possible. And this capability could also prove valuable in a crisis. For example, if a bomb goes off in one of our cities and law enforcement is racing to determine whether a network is poised to conduct additional attacks, time is of the essence. Being able to quickly review phone connections to assess whether a network exists is critical to that effort. In sum, the program does not involve the NSA examining the phone records of ordinary Americans. Rather, it consolidates these records into a database that the government can query if it has a specific lead. A consolidation of phone records that the companies already retained for business purposes. The review group turned up no indication that this database has been intentionally abused, and I believe it is important that the capability that this program is designed to meet is preserved. Having said that, I believe critics are right to point out that without proper safeguards, this type of program could be used to yield more information about our private lives and open the door to more intrusive bulk collection programs in the future. They're also right to point out that although the telephone bulk collection program was subject to oversight by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and has been reauthorized repeatedly by Congress, it has never been subject to vigorous public debate. For all these reasons, I believe we need a new approach. I am therefore ordering a transition that will end the Section 215 bulk metadata program as it currently exists and establish a mechanism that preserves the capabilities we need without the government holding this bulk metadata. This will not be simple. The review group recommended that our current approach be replaced by one in which the providers or a third party retain the bulk records, with government accessing information as needed. Both of these options pose difficult problems. Relying solely on the records of multiple providers, for example, could require companies to alter their procedures in ways that raise new privacy concerns. On the other hand, any third party maintaining a single consolidated database would be carrying out what's essentially a government function, but with more expense, more legal ambiguity, potentially less accountability, all of which would have a doubtful impact on increasing public confidence that their privacy is being protected. During the review process, some suggested that we may also be able to preserve the capabilities we need through a combination of existing authorities, better information sharing, and recent technological advances. But more work needs to be done to determine exactly how this system might work. Because of the challenges involved, I've ordered that the transition away from the existing program will proceed in 2 steps. Effective immediately, we will only pursue phone calls that are 2 steps removed from a number associated with a terrorist organization instead of the current 3. And I have directed the Attorney General to work with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court so that during this transition period, the database can be queried only after a judicial finding or in the case of a true emergency. Next, step 2. I've instructed the intelligence community and the Attorney General to use this transition period to develop options for a new approach that can match the capabilities and fill the gaps that the Section 215 program was designed to address without the government holding this metadata itself. They will report back to me with options for alternative approaches before the program comes up for reauthorization on March 28th. And during this period, I will consult with the relevant committees in Congress to seek their views, and then seek congressional authorization for the new program as needed. Now, the reforms I'm proposing today should give the American people greater confidence that their rights are being protected, even as our intelligence and law enforcement agencies maintain the tools they need to keep us safe. And I recognize that there are additional issues that require further debate. For example, some who participated in our review, as well as some members of Congress, would like to see more sweeping reforms to the use of national security letters, so we have to go to a judge each time before issuing these requests. Here I have concerns that we should not set a standard for terrorism investigations that is higher than those involved in investigating an ordinary crime. But I agree that greater oversight on the use of these letters may be appropriate, and I'm prepared to work with Congress on this issue. There are also those who would like to see different changes to the FISA court than the ones I've proposed. On all these issues, I'm open to working with Congress to ensure that we build a broad consensus for how to move forward. And I'm confident that we can shape an approach that meets our security needs while upholding the civil liberties of every American. Let me now turn to the separate set of concerns that have been raised overseas and focus on America's approach to intelligence collection abroad. As I've indicated, the United States has unique responsibilities when it comes to intelligence collection. Our capabilities help protect not only our nation, but our friends and our allies as well. But our efforts will only be effective if ordinary citizens in other countries have confidence that the United States respects their privacy too. And the leaders of our close friends and allies deserve to know that if I want to know what they think about an issue, I'll pick up the phone and call them, rather than turning to surveillance. In other words, just as we balance security and privacy at home, our global leadership demands that we balance our security requirements against our need to maintain the trust and cooperation among people and leaders around the world. For that reason, the new presidential directive that I've issued today will clearly prescribe what we do and do not do when it comes to our overseas surveillance. To begin with, the directive makes clear that the United States only uses signals intelligence for legitimate national security purposes and not for the purpose of indiscriminately reviewing the emails or phone calls of ordinary folks. I've also made it clear that the United States does not collect intelligence to suppress criticism or dissent, nor do we collect intelligence to disadvantage people on the basis of their ethnicity or race or gender or sexual orientation or religious beliefs. We do not collect intelligence to provide a competitive advantage to U.S. companies or U.S. commercial sectors. And in terms of our bulk collection of signals intelligence, U.S. intelligence agencies will only use such data to meet specific security requirements: counterintelligence, counterterrorism, counterproliferation, cybersecurity, force protection for our troops and our allies, and combating transnational crime, including sanctions evasion. In this directive, I have taken the unprecedented step of extending certain protections that we have for the American people to people overseas. I've directed the DNI, in consultation with the Attorney General, to develop these safeguards, which will limit the duration that we can hold personal information while also restricting the use of this information. The bottom line is that people around the world, regardless of their nationality, should know that the United States is not spying on ordinary people who don't threaten our national security. And that we take their privacy concerns into account in our policies and procedures. This applies to foreign leaders as well. Given the understandable attention that this issue has received, I've made clear to the intelligence community that unless there is a compelling national security purpose, we will not monitor the communications of heads of state and government of our close friends and allies. And I've instructed my national security team, as well as the intelligence community, to work with foreign counterparts to deepen our coordination and cooperation in ways that rebuild trust going forward. Now, let me be clear. Our intelligence agencies will continue to gather information about the intentions of governments, as opposed to ordinary citizens, around the world, in the same way that the intelligence services of every other nation does. We will not apologize simply because our services may be more effective. But heads of state and government with whom we work closely and on whose cooperation we depend should feel confident that we are treating them as real partners. And the changes I've ordered do just that. Finally, to make sure that we follow through on all these reforms, I'm making some important changes to how our government is organized. The State Department will designate a senior officer to coordinate our diplomacy on issues related to technology and signals intelligence. We will appoint a senior official at the White House to implement the new privacy safeguards that I've announced today. I will devote the resources to centralize and improve the process we use to handle foreign requests for legal assistance, keeping our high standards for privacy while helping foreign partners fight crime and terrorism. I've also asked my counselor, John Podesta, to lead a comprehensive review of big data and privacy. And this group will consist of government officials who, along with the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, will reach out to privacy experts, technologists, and business leaders and look how the challenges inherent in big data are being confronted by both the public and private sectors. Whether we can forge international norms on how to manage this data, and how we can continue to promote the free flow of information in ways that are consistent with both privacy and security. For ultimately, what's at stake in this debate goes far beyond a few months of headlines or passing tensions in our foreign policy. When you cut through the noise, what's really at stake is how we remain true to who we are in a world that is remaking itself at dizzying speed. Whether it's the ability of individuals to communicate ideas, to access information that would have once filled every great library in every country in the world, or to forge bonds with people on the other sides of the globe. Technology is remaking what is possible for individuals and for institutions and for the international order. So while the reforms that I've announced will point us in a new direction, I am mindful that more work will be needed in the future. One thing I'm certain of, this debate will make us stronger. And I also know that in this time of change, the United States of America will have to lead. It may seem sometimes that America is being held to a different standard. And I'll admit, the readiness of some to assume the worst motives by our government can be frustrating. No one expects China to have an open debate about their surveillance programs, or Russia to take privacy concerns of citizens in other places into account. But let's remember, we are held to a different standard precisely because we have been at the forefront of defending personal privacy and human dignity. As the nation that developed the internet, The world expects us to ensure that the digital revolution works as a tool for individual empowerment, not government control. Having faced down the dangers of totalitarianism and fascism and communism, the world expects us to stand up for the principle that every person has the right to think and write and form relationships freely. Because individual freedom is the wellspring of human progress. Those values make us who we are. And because of the strength of our own democracy, we should not shy away from high expectations. For more than 2 centuries, our Constitution has weathered every type of change because we've been willing to defend it. And because we've been willing to question the actions that have been taken in its defense. Today is no different. I believe we can meet high expectations. Together, let us chart a way forward that secures the life of our nation while preserving the liberties that make our nation worth fighting for. Thank you. God bless you. May God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
The President of the United States at the U.S. Justice Department outlining a series of reforms to NSA surveillance. Some will say he didn't go far enough. Others will say he went too far. There's a lot to dissect and digest right now, a lot to understand. I'm WOlf Blitzer here in Washington. Once again, we want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. Jim Sciutto, you're our chief national security correspondent. What did you take away from that?
I would say it was a thoughtful but also a confident speech. I think it's clear that there are things that the president is willing to apologize for and explain, but things that he's not going to. For instance, he says that he went too far with the spying on foreign leaders. He says, if I want to talk to Angela Merkel, I'll call her up on the telephone. He talked about, acknowledge that there's a perception that this went too far, and that's something that the U.S. is held to a higher standard on. On the other hand, he made the case for why bulk collection is still necessary. Why in today's world, when you can build a bomb in the basement or post 9/11, you need this kind of tool with more safeguards, but you need this kind of tool. He also, he will say, I'm not going to spy on foreign leaders, but he does say I'm going to spy on foreign governments. And it was a bit of a stroppy line from him there. He said, our intelligence agencies will continue to gather information about the intentions of governments. We will not apologize simply because our services may be more effective.
Yeah, and so, he sort of said this bulk data collection will continue,
right,
but he needs to work with Congress and others to come up with a new way to do it,
yeah,
and he has to do it by the end of March.
Right. He's trying to put in some more safeguards here. There are a lot of things he left up to Congress. What was interesting to me, Wolf, was he made the point, and I think he's right, that for intelligence to be effective, it has to have the trust of the American people. American people cannot believe that they're being spied on willy-nilly for no particular reason. And I think a concern of this administration has been, not just in the wake of Snowden, but before, with the controversy over drones, is that they need to demystify, to a certain degree, just exactly what we're doing. So what struck me today about what the president said is, we're going to keep this court, okay, but eventually we're going to declassify some of those opinions that they offer, so you lift the veil a little bit so the American people can see just how they deliberate. What was interesting to me was he didn't suggest that you ought to change the way this court is appointed. Right now, the Chief Justice appoints members of that court. He's going to leave that up to Congress. If Congress wants to change that. Also, he didn't say what we would do with all of this large quantity of data that we collect. He's also sort of punting that over to the Congress. But overall, I think what he was trying to do today was say to the American people, look, we're not just willy-nilly spying and snooping on you. We have reasons to do this, but I'm hearing you that you want to understand more about just why we're doing what we're doing.
Spider Marks, General Spider Marks, retired U.S. Army. Did he convince you?
Well, he convinced me that there needs to be some changes involved in the program. And as we've discussed, would any of this happen without Snowden? I'd argue that I don't know that the jury has come down hard on that completely and said, without Snowden, we wouldn't be doing any of this. The intelligence community, as a matter of routine, does internal reviews in terms of how they conduct operations, and there is sufficient oversight. The real issue that Gloria made is that it is not as transparent as maybe we would like it to be, and there are elements of that we need kind of exposed to daylight. The declassification of intelligence we do as a matter of routine. We're doing that with findings. We're going to do that with opinions. I think two things the president mentioned.
I just wanted to interrupt for a second, John. You don't think that that Edward Snowden's leaking all this sensitive information 6 months ago propelled this debate, generated this debate, and as a result of this enormous debate that's been going on here in the United States and around the world, the president of the United States has now come forward with a series of reforms?
The president took ownership of this issue because of the Snowden leaks. What I'm suggesting is that absent Snowden, there are routine mechanisms in place that are routinely used by our intelligence community to evaluate themselves and to improve their posture in terms of how they do business.
But don't you think the president was already thinking about this because he was getting a lot of grief from his left about drones, and that when he gave a speech to the National Defense University last May, that was something that he was clearly thinking about? I think Snowden added a whole different...
It was a double punch.
...level, right.
Drones, Snowden, I've got to embrace this. I've got to take ownership.
Exactly.
But I don't think I could imagine this speech today, the need for this speech, the intelligence reform panel, the urgency, you know, the turning of what would normally be an internal review into a very external review shown to the country and to the world without Edward Snowden.
Hold on for a second. We have Senator Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, potential Republican presidential candidate, joining us right now. Has been a sharp critic of the administration's NSA surveillance program. So what did you think, Senator? Were you pleased? Were you not so pleased?
Well, what I think I heard was that if you like your privacy, you can keep it. But in the meantime, we're going to keep collecting your phone records, your emails, your text messages, and likely your credit card information. So I didn't hear any lessening of the spying on Americans or collecting records of Americans. I heard that, trust me, I'm going to put some more safeguards in place, but I'm going to keep right on collecting every American's records. This is something that's going to have to be decided by the Supreme Court. I think there's a real fundamental question whether one general warrant can apply to millions of people's records. And I think it's incorrectly being done, and the Supreme Court's going to ultimately have to decide on this.
You've actually filed a lawsuit. Remind our viewers, what is so irritating, upsetting to you?
Well, the thing is that, you know, he mentioned Paul Revere, but Paul Revere was warning us of the British coming. He wasn't warning us that the Americans are coming. You know, the thing is that the lesson from the American Revolution that the president, I think, misunderstands is that we were upset about British soldiers writing their own general warrants, like national security letters, that allowed them to go into the colonialist house and look at their papers. We didn't like that. So we wrote the Fourth Amendment to say warrants have to be individualized. They have to name specifically the person and the place. We didn't want a dragnet where everybody's information was held, whether it's held by the government or a private entity. I'm not so sure I'm more or less concerned by having a private entity. Who are we going to hire? Eric Snowden's contractor to hold all the information? I don't want them collecting the information. It's not about who holds it. I don't want them collecting every American's information. You know, he mentioned 9/11. The thing about 9/11 is we didn't do the appropriate things because we didn't do good police work, and we never even asked for a warrant. An FBI agent in Minnesota sent 70 letters to his superiors asking, can we get a warrant on this guy who wants to take off planes but not land them? And they didn't do the appropriate thing. They never asked for a warrant, which they could have gotten. We don't need all this extra collection of information.
Here's a hypothetical, and we'll get your analysis of potentially what it means. And obviously there were a lot of mistakes leading up to 9/11. What they're trying to do is learn from those mistakes to make sure there isn't another 9/11. Let's say the U.S. intelligence community learns that there is a terrorist in Yemen or Somalia or Afghanistan or someplace in a sensitive area. They have the cell phone. They're monitoring that individual's cell phone. That individual makes a call to someone in Louisville, Kentucky, in your home state. What's wrong with the NSA then getting a court order from the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and trying to find out what that phone conversation between Somalia and Yemen, that terrorist suspect there, and someone in Louisville?
I have no objection to having a warrant for a specific person to look at phone calls. And if we then get a warrant, we find out the person in Louisville is connected to the person in Yemen, then we get a warrant for all of their phone calls. If they called 100 people last month, we look at those 100, and then we ask the judge for another warrant. So I don't care if it's 10 hops out with a warrant, but for the president to say, oh, we're only going to abuse the Fourth Amendment twice and not get warrants by hopping twice, not 3 times, it's either proper or improper, and there is a proper way of doing this, and this is with a judicial warrant individualized to the person, and then you can go and look at their friends with another warrant. We do this all the time. At 4 a.m., if there's somebody who's a potential murderer or rapist or you name it, we just call a judge and get a warrant, but we separate the police power from the judicial power. That's why we have to, I think, really reassess whether or not police officers or FBI agents should write their own warrants. I think only judges should write warrants.
At one point in the speech, and the president spoke for about 45 minutes, Senator, he made this point. Let me play this little clip.
After an extended review of our use of drones in the fight against terrorist networks, I believed a fresh examination of our surveillance programs was a necessary next step in our effort to get off the open-ended war footing that we've maintained since 9/11. And for these reasons, I indicated in a speech at the National Defense University last May that we needed a more robust public discussion about the balance between security and liberty. Of course, what I did not know at the time is that within weeks of my speech, an avalanche of unauthorized disclosures would spark controversies at home and abroad that have continued to this day.
He then went on to mention Edward Snowden. Specifically, he said, given the fact of an open investigation, I'm not going to dwell on Mr. Snowden's actions or motivations. Where does Edward Snowden, from your perspective, fit into this current debate and these proposed reforms the president put forward today?
You know, I think it leads to whether or not you think the president is genuinely concerned or not. I don't think we'd be here, and I think there'd be absolutely no reform had there not been the releases by Snowden. Now, it's a separate question, you know, what to do with him and whether he broke the law, which I think he did, and how he should be punished. But the thing is, we wouldn't have any of this information and we wouldn't have any discussion. But what I think the president misunderstands is he thinks when there's a problem and there may be a potential for abuse of problems, he'll get some lawyers together that all work for him, and then they'll review it and put more safeguards on it. The NSA cannot oversee themselves. The administration or the executive branch can't oversee themselves. That's why we separate these powers. But we separated the police power from the judiciary power. So we can't have internal lawyers kind of looking at this and saying, oh, well, let's try to make sure everybody's privacy is taken care of. See, really, he's not going to fundamentally change any of this. Many of us think it's an invasion of our privacy to have our text messages collected, our emails collected, our phone records collected, and likely our credit card statements collected. We think that's an invasion of privacy, simply the collection, unless you get a warrant from a judge for a specific person that there's probable cause to think that they've committed a crime. That's the way our country was set up. And so what he's talking about is a different kind of country than our founding fathers envisioned.
He did say at one point that even though there should be a healthy skepticism, he found no evidence that there has been any abuse by anyone at the NSA as far as the personal privacy records of the American citizens. You heard him say that.
You know, I think that if you look back through the record, though, the FISA court actually has rebuked the NSA on several occasions and said that they were doing things they shouldn't be doing. But I have a fundamental problem with the FISA court. It's in secret. And so you can't discuss and determine the extent of the Fourth Amendment or the extent or circumspection or circumscription of the Constitution in secret. It has to be done in public. So one of the reforms that I've proposed, and I have legislation that would do this, would say that if you're given a FISA court order and you want to challenge the constitutionality of it, it should go to an appellate court and to the Supreme Court. Right now it's a dead end. In the FISA court, a secret court and a secret judge, without adversarial, without arguments on both sides. Only the government argues in FISA. That's not the way you can determine what is and what is not constitutional. It has to be in the light of day, and I think it needs to be before the Supreme Court.
If they add a public advocate to that FISA court system, is that going to satisfy you?
It's better, and my reform that I'm doing with Senator Wyden does have a public advocate in there, But ultimately, I think what legal scholars will tell you is that to find truth, we have this adversarial process where someone actually literally works for you on your side of the question and on the government side of the question, and it goes back and forth, and it's our way of trying to find truth in our courts. And I don't think you can truly find it if the public advocate still works for the government. You know, we have an IRS advocate right now, and I haven't seen hide nor hair of our IRS advocate during these scandals when they were investigating Tea Party groups. So I don't think it works necessarily if they're appointed by the government. To truly have an adversarial process, they have to be hired by someone who thinks that they're being injured by the government.
Senator, give the president a grade for his speech today, A being excellent, F failure.
You know, I always give him an A for effort. I like the president. I like what he says so much. I mean, if you looked at the gist of what he was saying all the right things. I want to stand up and cheer until I realized what he just told me was all these great things about my privacy, except for he really, between the lines, told me he's going to continue to collect all of my private records without a warrant. So he says the right thing. I think his heart really is in the right place. And I think his motives are not bad. Neither do I think James Clapper's motives are bad. I think they want to protect the country, but I don't think that there's enough of a healthy respect for the Fourth Amendment. And government needs to be, there needs to be a limitation to government power. And I see this as virtually unlimited power to look at our records, and it really needs to be reined in.
So the grade would be?
Well, A for effort and probably C for content.
Senator Paul, thanks very much for coming in, giving us your immediate reaction to the president's speech. We appreciate it as always.
Thank you, Wolf.
We're going to have a lot more analysis of what we just heard from the president, what it means as far as a potential avoiding another 9/11. The president repeatedly referred to 9/11 in this 45-minute address. Jeffrey Toobin, Asheligh Banfield, a lot of our experts are standing by. We'll be right back. Major speech by the president outlining a series of reforms to NSA surveillance. The president speaking over at the Justice Department, wrapping up just a few moments ago. Jim Acosta is our senior White House correspondent. You were listening very closely. I know you're also getting some serious briefings over there by other national security officials over at the White House. So where do we go from here? Where the president says he's got a new idea to collect all this information, not let the NSA store it, not necessarily let the private companies store it, but who's going to store it? And he's got this 2-month deadline now between March and 28th when the current law expires to come up with some sort of formula.
Right, and that's why I would characterize this next stage, Wolf, as fill in the blanks, because at this point, the administration does not have the answers to fill in those blanks. You mentioned the question of where to store this metadata. If not at the NSA, then where? A senior administration official who was on a phone call with reporters earlier this morning before the speech, the information was embargoed until the president delivered it, said that, by the way, this cannot be implemented at the flip of a switch. They cannot all of a sudden move this to a separate location. They have to begin this process now of consulting with the intelligence community, consulting with the carriers, consulting with lawmakers as to where to put that data. The other issue of the privacy advocate, that this is going to be a panel of privacy advocates on the surveillance court. Senior administration officials said these are non-existing panels to the court. So at this point, they are recognizing full well, Wolf, that they know that these are things that have not been done before, and they're going to take some time to implement. So, you know, when we hear the president say, you know, he's announcing all of these changes today, keep in mind it's going to take some time to implement those changes. And Wolf, the other thing that stood out in the speech is that the president did directly address former NSA contractor Edward Snowden. Didn't get into the details of his case, didn't tip his hand one way or the other as to whether or not Mr. Snowden should be granted some leniency, but he did say, for all practical intents and purposes, it is not possible to have employees of your national security apparatus leaking information and just getting away with it. And here's some of what the president had to say earlier.
Now, given the fact of an open investigation, I'm not going to dwell on Mr. Snowden's actions or his motivations. I will say that our nation's defense depends in part on the fidelity of those entrusted with our nation's secrets. If any individual who objects to government policy can take it into their own hands to publicly disclose classified information, then we will not be able to keep our people safe or conduct foreign policy.
So there you have the president talking about Edward Snowden, Wolf. And one thing that, you know, sort of related to Edward Snowden is this, one of the revelations that he produced is the fact that the United States has been doing a lot of surveillance on foreign leaders. One thing that was mentioned in that conference call with reporters, a senior administration official characterized the quantity of those leaders that they will not be surveilling anymore as, quote, dozens. And so they're talking about dozens of foreign leaders that they're no longer going to be doing this type of surveillance on. At the same time, we should also mention that John Podesta, a recent hire over here at the White House, a veteran of the Clinton administration, but brought on as a top advisor to the president, he's going to be conducting a review of management of surveillance data, and that is something that's going to be going on here as well. So I would characterize these next several weeks and maybe months, Wolf, as sort of a fill-in-the-blanks period for this White House. They don't have all the answers yet as to what comes next.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions raised as well when the president says the U.S. is going to stop spying on the personal phone conversations of foreign leaders. There is a huge caveat there. What he did say, and I have it right in front of me, he said, unless there is a compelling national security purpose, we will not monitor the communications of heads of state and government, of our close friends and allies. So
that's right.
The first caveat is, what is the compelling national security purpose, and who are America's close friends and allies? We have viewers watching us right now here in the United States and around the world who will want to fill in the blank on that sensitive point as well. Which country has a leader who's described as a close friend and ally of the United States, and which countries do not? I suspect we'll be getting more on that in the days to come as well. Stand by for a moment. Asheligh Banfield is watching all of this together with Jeffrey Toobin in New York. There are going to be a lot of legal questions, Asheligh, that are coming up right now, especially going forward with these new reforms.
Yeah, and I think Jim just touched on that beautifully, that I think the next, few months are going to be pretty significant in how much more we're going to have added to this 45-minute speech. The president started with the work has just begun. I think that really is an understatement. Jeffrey Toobin and I have been discussing this throughout this speech. Two big things that you and I were waiting to hear, and we're not sure that we were satisfied on this. Number one, just how much of this material might end up before the FISA court. Where will this metadata ultimately be stored? And then number two, how adversarial is this FISA court going to be? This panel of ombudsmen, are they going to be part of the process? Will they get to argue, or will they just be sort of that office where you get to send your complaint?
Right. Here's an interesting situation, because when an ordinary prosecutor, when I was an assistant U.S. attorney and I wanted to get a search warrant, that was not an adversarial process. When I wanted a search warrant, I would just go to a magistrate and say, here's the affidavit, we want to search this house. What the president seemed to be suggesting is that the FISA court could become more of an adversarial process, where the government, the NSA, through the Department of Justice, would say, we want to look at this data, and there would be some privacy participants, some committee, some lawyers, and what that role would be and at what stage in the process is very important. Also, what information would they have access to? Are you saying they're government lawyers? Are you saying they're outside lawyers?
Well, he did say they were outside the government. So there's step one. At least that's, as Senator Paul outlined, that's critical. These are outside the government.
But if they're outside the government,
where do they get to walk?
Well, if they're outside the government, do they have access to all the information in this super secret court? I mean, if that's true, that would be an enormous change. And so I think that's something very much to keep an eye on, whether it becomes a true adversary process in terms of whether the in terms of what the FISA court decides. Are they really going to be here from two informed sides on those
and if
issues?
they get to actually argue and be part of that ultimate process. I'm always brought back to 1755 and Ben Franklin's comments, and they're always parsed differently and requoted differently, but the best I can come up with to the Pennsylvania Assembly is, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. And Ben Franklin never walked around with one of those, what I like to call mobile life devices. Everything now is digital. Everything has changed. Our adversaries now have things that we need to keep up with, keeping up with the Joneses, and the president alluded to that. But in doing that, he's spoken very broad strokes. And I feel like we still don't have a lot of the answers as to how much of this new process will be overseen by the courts.
And the big question, which Jim just referred to, and I thought Rand Paul had a very interesting perspective on this, is, okay, the metadata will no longer be at the NSA. It will be somewhere else. Where? How? And one of the things I thought Senator Paul made, point he made, is if you put it somewhere else, then it could be just as insecure there, and you have a whole new set of privacy. Is this part of the government? Is it a private contractor? So the idea of keeping it away from the NSA, it may sound good, but you could create a whole new set of problems.
Yeah, how secure
as well.
is the new vault?
Now the committee
Sure.
suggested, the outside committee that the president appointed, said just leave it with the companies.
They don't want it.
Well, they don't want it, and also it's not clear how easy it would be to get there.
Right.
So that's a real open question
And then
heading forward.
for the audience who, this is pretty arcane stuff, and when they talk about the national security letters, is that sort of a fancy term for it's a subpoena without a judge? Effectively, it's a subpoena I just get to write, send, and receive. What effectively did the president say about the national security letters and just how much more strict they're going to become, if anything?
Right, we're going to try to do fewer of them, he said. And also, we're going to put time limits on them. We will get access in a defined period of time. But again, subpoenas are not an adversarial process in normal circumstances. Again, when I was a prosecutor, prosecutors every day, you want a subpoena for bank records?
Become public later. That's the issue. Many of those things become public later. These, they just don't. FISA material just stays secret, and that's a big concern as well.
It is, but I think a lot of people expect things to be more public than they are. The grand jury process, the government criminal investigation process is mostly conducted in secret now. Right. And so the idea of bringing in an adversary process is very different. And so we'll see if the president and his team can come up with one. But let's not kid ourselves. That's not how the system works now.
Right. No, and I think a lot of people definitely understand their secrecy, but then to hear what Edward Snowden says is the extent of it. So, Wolf, effectively, while this is intriguing to listen to, it's great to hear the president take these steps. I think you could say that they're somewhat baby steps. There's a lot more work to do. He even said it, as I mentioned, a lot more work ahead. And a lot of that work, it'll be interesting to find out how much we find out about it.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions still that have to be answered, and I'm sure we'll get some answers. Probably some of those questions we won't be getting any answers to for national security considerations. All right, Asheligh, Jeffrey, thanks very much. By the way, Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, he's standing by to speak live to react to what the president has just said. There he is right there. He's in London. We'll hear from Julian Assange. We'll get a lot more analysis as our special coverage here on CNN continues.
I'm Jake Tapper, and this is CNN.
The bottom line is that people around the world, regardless of their nationality, should know that the United States is not spying on ordinary people who don't threaten our national security. And that we take their privacy concerns into account in our policies and procedures. This applies to foreign leaders as well. Given the understandable attention that this issue has received, I've made clear to the intelligence community that unless there is a compelling national security purpose, we will not monitor the communications of heads of state and government of our close friends and allies. And I've instructed my national security team, as well as the intelligence community, to work with foreign counterparts to deepen our coordination and cooperation in ways that rebuild trust going forward.
All right, so the president speaking to folks all over the world. A lot of them have been upset about U.S. surveillance of some foreign leaders, including friendly foreign leaders like Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. Let's get some analysis. Bob Baer is a CNN security and intelligence analyst, former case officer over at the CIA. There's a huge out in that statement that the president said. You heard it. If there's a compelling reason to do so, the U.S. is going to go back and listen in on some of those conversations.
Oh, absolutely. If there's a political crisis anywhere in the world, we have to be able to turn the National Security Agency on it. Go back to listening to the phones. I think he was absolutely right. It's not worthwhile now listening to the German Chancellor's phone and the rest of it. Cut that out. Don't waste our time. But we reserve the right to listen to anybody we want, any foreign government. He's right.
Jim Sciutto, give me a thought about where we go from here.
Well, I think clearly this is not the end of the conversation. A lot of the questions have been left open. We've talked about who holds this data, for how long, and how long do they have to decide who holds the data. The public advocate that he's talking about says that this public advocate will take part in significant cases. What are those significant cases? Who's going to define it? How often? Apparently it's up to Congress to decide. One thing we didn't hear a lot about is the effect on businesses. You and I have had some conversations about the billions of dollars lost for U.S. technology businesses abroad because of this, because they're concerned that their customers are going to be spied on. He didn't talk about encryption. When will the NSA break encryption? Will they subvert software? I mean, these are key issues to U.S. technology companies, our leading companies around the world. Those questions still need to be answered, and some of them are the most difficult questions involved in this.
And it's interesting, Gloria, some of his harshest criticism is not necessarily from Republicans, but from liberal Democrats who aren't very happy about this entire program and probably won't be very satisfied by what they heard today.
Liberal Democrats and libertarian Republicans, as you heard from Rand Paul earlier. Look, I think what the president did today was he raised all the questions, but he made it very clear he didn't have a lot of the answers. I mean, for example, to Jim's point about he wants the government to get out of the business of holding all of this information. But on the other hand, he's not quite sure where to put it. And so he's saying to the Justice Department, can you come up with some ideas about where to put it? He's not, he's suggesting some changes of the court, have an advocate on the other side. But he wants some different approaches. But it's clear he's done an extensive review here that the answers are not that obvious to him. What he did say is that technology is changing dramatically every second, and that this country has not kept up with the changes, and we have to figure out a way to keep up with the changes in technology, protect our citizens, and protect our privacy, and it's just not easy.
Very, very difficult indeed. An enormous challenge for the President of the United States, and we just saw a brief reflection of that during that 45-minute address. All right, I'll be back at the top of the hour. Much more special coverage of what's going on here in Washington, all the day's other news. CNN's Around the World with Suzanne Malveaux. That picks up in just a moment. Her special guest, Julian Assange from London. We're anxious to get his reaction to what we just heard from the President.
Welcome to Around the World. I'm Suzanne Malveaux. Our special coverage continues on the new rules to protect your privacy from the vast buying powers of the federal government without compromising national security. President Obama just laying out his plan to reform the NSA surveillance program in a speech just a short time ago. The new safeguards include putting limits on the controversial bulk collection of telephone records, also setting up a special public advocate to argue privacy rights cases inside a secret intelligence surveillance court. Also increasing privacy protections for people overseas, particularly heads of state. Many are already arguing that these are not necessarily sweeping changes, but the president does hope that the reforms will help restore trust in U.S. spy practices at home and around the world.
The directive makes clear that the United States only uses signals intelligence for legitimate national security purposes and not for the purpose of indiscriminately reviewing the emails or phone calls of ordinary folks. I've also made it clear that the United States does not collect intelligence to suppress criticism or dissent, nor do we collect intelligence to disadvantage people on the basis of their ethnicity or race or gender or sexual orientation or religious beliefs. We do not collect intelligence to provide a competitive advantage to U.S. companies or U.S. commercial sectors. The bottom line is that people around the world, regardless of their nationality, should know that the United States is not spying on ordinary people who don't threaten our national security. And that we take their privacy concerns into account.
The president's decision to reform the NSA surveillance program is a direct result of the blockbuster leaks by former government contractor Edward Snowden. His revelations last year sparked concerns that the government had gone too far with its surveillance programs. Now, Snowden is in Russia after receiving temporary asylum. He got it with the help of course, Wikileaks. Want to welcome Wikileaks founder Julian Assange. He is a man who exposed volumes of secret government documents online years before the Snowden leaks. Julian Assange, thank you for joining us here. He joins us from the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he has been holed up for more than a year and a half. And I've got to ask you this first go round here, straight up. When you listen to the president's comments here, it is the first time that we have seen at least some restrictions on the NSA since September 11th attacks. Requirements for specific approval from the courts, more oversight from Congress, specific presidential approval on spying on national leaders. You've given up your life to provide this platform to expose these secrets through your website. Are you satisfied with what you've heard?
Well, look, I think it's embarrassing for a head of state to go on like that for 45 minutes and say almost nothing. Unfortunately, one has to deconstruct a little of what has been said in the points that you've raised. First of all, let's look for some positive in what has come out of here. Well, it's clear that the president would not be speaking today were it not for the actions of Edward Snowden and whistleblowers before him like Frank Drake and Binney. Those national security whistleblowers have forced this debate. This president has been dragged, kicking and screaming, to today's address. He has been very reluctant to make any concrete reforms, and unfortunately today we also see very few concrete reforms. What we see is kicking off the ball into the congressional grass, kicking it off into panels of lawyers that he will that he will instruct to report back at some stage in the future. My greatest concern, I think, looking at this broader package, is that there is what was not said. There was no restriction on secret law. The FISA court, which he named as the court that will review some of this process, is known to be the most secret captive court in the United States that's producing secret judge-made law. There was a law, Section 215, that was designed to protect American citizens from these invasive searches and seizures. The FISA court and the DOJ secretly reinterpreted that law to make it apply to the entire country.
Let me ask you this, if I can interrupt just for a moment here. Stopped. If I can just interrupt for just a moment here. One of the things that the president did talk about is at least some sort of public advocate who would work on behalf of individuals who they might have these the phone numbers, that there would be some process, that there would be a way of actually protecting those individuals. You don't see that that is significant in any way in trying to at least establish some sort of benefit, someone who would act on this person's behalf, a citizen's behalf?
Well, look, the FISA court itself was originally set up following recommendations from the Church Committee in the 70s, and over time was quickly corrupted. So a public advocate constantly in the FISA court in that secret manner is unlikely to produce a decent result. That said, of course, it is a small advance. We have to see whether it be implemented, who would be this public advocate. Presumably they'll have to be security cleared, which means the NSA will have to approve of them in some way. There's still issues to do with the appointment of FISA court judges. But the big problem with the FISA court is the creation of secret judge-made law that is capable of reinterpreting anything that Congress passes in order to make it acceptable for the NSA to engage in bulk collection activity. What we didn't hear from the president was any meaningful protection of US business. And, you know, I've been involved in the tech industry for a long time. I know my friends in the US are really hurting as a result of of what has happened in the NSA. As far as the outside world is concerned, the United States has become an archipelago of coercion, where any person you were dealing with in business at Google or Facebook or Yahoo or at a telecommunications company might have become secretly an agent of the National Security Agency because they're ordered to do so by the FISA court, and they're forced to keep that secret or through the mechanism of national security letters.
Let me talk a little bit.
At the moment, sure, Europe has much more competitive protections than the United States for cloud data. IBM's exports of its mainframe computers to China this year cut back 40%.
Julian,
the US tech industry is hemorrhaging, and there's no protection no meaningful protection given in
I understand your point there, because there are at least a group of people from the telecommunications business who did visit with the president who complained that there were problems in terms of competition, saying that their own software was being tainted. That was a problem to get public trust, if you will, for those particular companies. So that is a valid point. But the president did acknowledge that the U.S. has gone too far in spying on world leaders. He's saying that, you know, if he wants to talk to the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, he can pick up the phone and call her. That he's not necessarily going to spy on foreign leaders, but would still spy on foreign governments. I want you to listen to the distinction that the president made.
Now, let me be clear. Our intelligence agencies will continue to gather information about the intentions of governments, as opposed to ordinary citizens, around the world, in the same way that the intelligence services of every other nation does. We will not apologize simply because our services may be more effective.
Isn't that an important distinction here? I mean, he does give some assurances that, you know, this is not going to be something that's going to be done nilly-willy here, that they will have to have at least some sort of national security concern if they're going to look at these foreign leaders and foreign governments. And he makes that distinction.
Well, we heard a lot of lies in this speech by Obama. He said, for example, that the National Security Agency has never abused what it has done. When the FISA court has found, even the FISA court has found again and again that it has done just that. So if the National Security Agency is interpreting what national security means, the secret court, FISA, is interpreting what national security means, well, of course, these are ambiguous, woolly terms. And in a secret institution, they gradually become corrupted over time. That's precisely how we ended up in this process. But okay, you can say that we're not going to spy on Angela Merkel or
yes, go ahead.
Yeah, we're not going to spy on Angela Merkel or David Cameron. We're not going to spy on Angela Merkel or David Cameron or the Australian Prime Minister. Sure, but you don't spy on them. You just spy on everyone else that they talk to. I mean, it doesn't mean anything to not spy on world leaders. Maybe you can save a bit of PR flack if another Edward Snowden comes along. I don't think actually the spying on world leaders why it can cause PR problems. I don't see that, to me, as a real concern. The real concern is that when you have an organization as powerful as the National Security Agency has become, and its Five Eyes allies, and the cost of engaging in mass surveillance is decreasing about 50% every 2 years because of the cheapness of computers and the cheapness of bandwidth. That is a threat to constitutional government in the United States and also into other countries. What I wanted to see today was a mechanism that would retard that tendency of producing a long-term threat to constitutional government. I don't see that. I don't see that individuals are protected from those surveillance abuses. I don't see any prosecutions. You know, a government is serious when it starts talking about someone's going to be prosecuted. It's going to prosecute Edward Snowden.
Julian,
I didn't see talk of prosecution of James Clapper, investigation of anyone being fired, the National Security Agency being split apart into its functions, decreases in budgets, or any protection. Meaningful protection.
We're going to get more. We're going to get more from you in just a moment. We've got to take a quick break here, but obviously we're going to get more about Edward Snowden. We're going to get more about Julian Assange, his own life there in the embassy, and what is next for him. Going to take a quick break first.
I'm Anderson Cooper. This is CNN.
We're back with Julian Assange, the founder of Wikileaks, and thank you for joining us. Appreciate your time, of course, after the president's speech dealing with some of the reforms that he's talking about in the NSA. I want to talk about Edward Snowden, who is now in Russia. He's granted temporary asylum for his role in releasing and exposing those classified NSA surveillance programs. There have been some pretty high-powered folks who don't want to see Snowden harshly punished here. For instance, senators like Rand Paul, who we just heard from within the last hour, as well as the New York Times, Rand Paul saying, I don't think Edward Snowden deserves the death penalty or life in prison. I think that's inappropriate, and I think that's why he fled. New York Times editorial, it is time for the United States to offer Mr. Snowden a plea bargain or some form of clemency that would allow him to return home. Here's what the president said about Snowden today.
I will say that our nation's defense depends in part on the fidelity of those entrusted with our nation's secrets. If any individual who objects to government policy can take it into their own hands to publicly disclose classified information, then we will not be able to keep our people safe or conduct foreign policy.
So, Julian, he's still saying that he doesn't think that Snowden went about this the right way. What do you think is appropriate for Snowden?
Well, look, obviously the internal mechanisms failed. This president failed, this administration failed, the National Security Agency failed to hold itself to account internally. When there's a failure of internal oversight, other people have to step into the role. And that's what Edward Snowden has done. That's what the press involved in this matter has done. Edward Snowden next week will be making, I believe, an online response to President Obama on freesnowden.is. His defense team and defense fund.
Tell us more about that. When was the last time you talked to Edward Snowden or his team?
Well, because of communication security concerns, which must be all too obvious, I don't speak directly about the nature of my communications. The UK government has admitted to spending £6 million, about $10 million so far on spying on me in this embassy, just with the police alone. But I think Edward Snowden today will be quite happy that at least there is 45 minutes of a president speaking about these issues. There's going to be a lot of debate generated as a result of the president's statements, debates including some of the details. For example, if an independent body is created to hold that data, well, presumably the FBI and other law enforcement bodies will also go after it. We know what the situation is in Europe. Many European countries tell their telcos to hold the data for 18 months. Others, such as Germany, have found that to be unconstitutional. It's deleted. What's the difference in the United States, where people in the United States are subject to less rights than Europe, despite the Fourth Amendment? So clearly there's a problem there. Edward Snowden and other NSA whistleblowers have seen that problem and are addressing it.
Julian,
in relation to your question about Edward Snowden's circumstance and what will happen with him, well, he is, thanks to our efforts and some lawyers, safe now in Russia. His visa is coming up for renewal in 8 months, his asylum visa. I suppose that is an important time for him and people should be supportive of him. It's outrageous to see President Obama condemning him on the one hand and saying it at the same time. So,
excuse me, do you know if he was watching the president's speech? You say that he's going to be responding in about a week or so. Do you know if he was watching?
He will be responding next week, I believe, possibly early next week. I'm not sure if he's watching, but I'm sure he's following the matter quite closely. I know he does follow the debate and the reform debate in the United States quite closely.
And let's talk about your own circumstance here, because what we understand is that at least here in the United States, that you are likely not going to be facing charges. Officials have indicated that there is no sealed indictment against you. And according to the New York Times, Justice Department officials are saying that, you know, if they were to prosecute you, they'd have to prosecute many news organizations in the United States and journalists as well. They're just not going to do that. If that's off the table, right, and you're not going to have to likely face charges in the United States, you still face the allegations in Sweden of sexual misconduct. You've repeatedly said those are politically motivated, retribution for your website. Would you consider stepping out of the embassy grounds, off the grounds, taking your case and defending yourself in Sweden to prove them wrong?
Well, look, unfortunately, it's not the case, what you claim. That was one anonymous official speaking anonymously to the Washington Post. Subsequently, the district attorney involved in the matter, in our grand jury, which has now been going for 3 years, the biggest investigation into a publisher, the most expensive that has ever occurred in US history.
I'm sorry, what did you say was not the case?
Federal attorney.
Are you talking about the allegations in Sweden, or are you talking about the indictment in the United States?
Formally, the investigation into WikiLeaks and me continues in the United States. It's run by the Virginia Virginia federal attorney. He has confirmed that it formally continues. There seems to be some debate, perhaps within the DOJ, about the correctness of that investigation. I hope that our staff are protected and that wiser heads prevail in the US and drop that investigation. But unfortunately, now it continues. We know that a wide range of people have been involved in that investigation. The FBI, the NSA, the CIA has publicly declared that it's been involved in that investigation, the Pentagon, etc. 12 US government agencies. It has been the largest investigation into a publisher ever. It has gone for more than 3 years, and it continues. It's a disgrace. It's a threat to journalists. It's a threat to my staff. Thanks to our lawyers, we've been fighting it, but thus far it continues. In relation to the Swedish matter, I have not been charged in Sweden. There are allegations. The Ecuadorian government has asked that Sweden not extradite me to the US if I go to Sweden. Unfortunately, Sweden has refused, and it also refuses to come here to speak to me, and thus, unfortunately, we're at impasse.
So you remain where you are in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Julian Assange, thank you so much for your time, for your perspective. We really appreciate your taking the time this afternoon. And thanks for watching Around the World. CNN Newsroom starts right after this.
Right now, too far or not far enough. A reaction pouring in after President Obama lays out his plan to change the way the United States government spies. Also right now, California declares a drought emergency. Some cities see annual rain amounts 30 to 40 inches below normal. The danger is growing as wildfires spread. And right now, with an AARP card and a dance party, the First Lady of the United States, Michelle Obama, marks the Big 5-0. Hello, I'm Wolf Blitzer reporting from Washington. We start with President Obama's big announcement of sweeping changes to American surveillance. In his highly anticipated speech just a little while ago, he defended the bulk collection of telephone records, but also announced that the program needs to be overhauled with changes to how and why those records are accessed.
I have approved a new presidential directive for our signals intelligence activities, both at home and abroad. This guidance will strengthen executive branch oversight of our intelligence activities. It will ensure that we take into account our security requirements, but also our alliances, our trade and investment relationships, including the concerns of American companies, and our commitment to privacy and basic liberties. And we will review decisions about intelligence priorities and sensitive targets on an annual basis so that our actions are regularly scrutinized by my senior national security team.
Among the specifics are strengthening executive branch oversight of surveillance activities, also designating independent privacy advocates to oversee some aspects, new restrictions on collection of information from Americans and foreign citizens. He also promised to stop monitoring heads of state of American friends and allies, and he announced that a new White House official will be designated to implement new privacy safeguards. Let's talk about what we just heard from the president, the surveillance reforms that he outlined. Joining us, the Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. He's the independent senator from Vermont. Senator, thanks very much for coming in.
My pleasure.
You and I have discussed this on several occasions over the past several months. At one point you said strong new limits are needed to protect the privacy and civil liberties of the American people. Did the president go far enough today, in your opinion?
Wolf, the devil is going to be in the details. I think in a very significant way, the president began the conversation on what is a very difficult issue and a complicated issue. It's difficult because everybody wants to see us do all that we can to protect the American people from terrorism. It is complicated because every single day technology changes. And the question of how we protect the American people without undermining our privacy rights and our constitutional rights is a huge issue. I'm going to be having a town meeting in Montpelier, Vermont on this on February 1st. I would hope that millions of people become engaged in this enormously important issue. I think the president started that conversation. We've got a long way to go.
As you have said, and I'm quoting you once again, that this current NSA surveillance program, in your words, represents a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment ban on unreasonable searches. So what you heard today, the outlines of some reforms, are you satisfied?
I think it's a start. To my mind, when every telephone call made by every single American is on file in the NSA, that is clearly, to my mind, a violation of the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution. No question in my mind, and that has got to end. President,
let me interrupt you, Senator. President says that he wants to continue doing that, but not storing it any longer over at the NSA. The companies that have all these records, they don't want to store it for a variety of legal and other privacy considerations. So who's going to store all these records? Who would be an appropriate source or person or institution to do such a thing?
Well, Wolf, it's not a question. You're asking who should store it. The question is whether they should be stored.
The president says that they should be stored. The president says by the end of March he wants a new formula to store all that information. So in case there's some sort of threat of a terrorist operation, they can sort of connect the dots and find out who might be responsible.
Again, the devil is in the details, but I don't agree with the overall position of the president on that issue. Again, I do not think it is that the Constitution of the United States supports the belief that every call made by every American, 99.99% who have nothing to do with terrorism, should be kept on file. Look, you know, let me tell you what I'm really concerned about in this whole business, Wolf, and it's a very subtle thing. There are writers' organizations who say, you know what, when we write stuff on the internet, we are now fearful of what we're putting on. We don't put everything that we're thinking. You got kids in America who walk into a library and are saying, you know, should I get that biography of Osama bin Laden? Should I write that report, or is somebody going to think I am involved in terrorist activity? What we want as a nation is our young people and all of our people to be brave. You want to sign a petition without worrying that the government is going to keep file on you. You want to investigate an issue, you want to research a paper. We want an inquisitive, curious people. That's what freedom is about. And I think all of this stuff has a very significant, chilling impact on the willingness of the American people to be thinking about issues, to be writing about issues, to be talking about issues. That is my fear.
I'll ask you a question I asked Senator Rand Paul, your colleague, the Republican senator from Kentucky, a little while ago. Let's say the NSA determines a known terrorist suspect in some country, whether Yemen or Somalia or Afghanistan or someplace, is making a phone call to someone in Burlington, Vermont, for example. Do you want the NSA to check out who that individual is, why this known terrorist suspect is making a phone call to an American in Vermont?
Yes. In other words, look, where there is reason to believe that somebody may be involved in a terrorist attack, I want our government to do everything that it can to protect the American people. But what I do not want are files being kept on the 99.99% of Americans who have nothing to do with terrorism.
So how do you bridge that gap? How do you protect national security on the one hand and prevent another 9/11, while on the other hand making sure that Americans' privacy is protected?
Well, that is the question. And let me add to that question by saying that that technology is changing every day. And think about what technology will be like in 10 years from now. And that is why we need a constant discussion and debate on this issue. My own view is that at this point, we have gone too far in attacking the privacy rights of the American people. But you're asking the right question. And there is no simple answer. And that answer will change 10 years from now. We need a massive conversation on the parts of the American people to say, how do we protect ourselves from folks who we know want to hurt us, but do it in a way that maintains us as a free society? Not an easy thing. President started this discussion. I would go further than the president in terms of protecting privacy rights. But this is an issue that Congress has got to embrace. It has to move up the totem pole in terms of important issues that we discuss.
One final quick question, if you can give me a quick answer. You raised a sensitive subject the other day, whether or not the NSA is spying on members of Congress like yourself, senators and representatives. You've gotten some answers from them. Are they satisfactory?
Well, not really. I mean, what we have been told by the NSA in a response to a media query is that all of the phone calls that members of Congress make are kept in the same files that every American. And the danger there is, and I'm concerned about all Americans, the dangers about members of Congress is it is just when you have that information, Wolf, it is easy to engage. If you had a rogue operator, if you had an unscrupulous president, you really could start blackmailing members of Congress, impact public policy, impact elections.
And you earlier, in an earlier conversation we had, you recalled Richard M. Nixon on what potentially could be done along those lines. All right, Senator, you want to make a final point?
Well, Justin, I want people to think if Nixon had the resources and the technology that now exists, think of what he would have done.
Bernie Sanders is the independent senator from the state of Vermont. He caucuses with the Democrats, as all of our viewers know. Always good to have you here on CNN. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Up next, we'll get more reaction, more analysis of the president's surveillance reform proposals. Gloria Borger, Peter Berg, and Jim Sciutto, they're all standing by. They will weigh in. Changes to the way the NSA operates. That's what President Obama ordered just a little while ago. Those changes include not spying on friendly heads of state. Watch this.
The bottom line is that people around the world, regardless of their nationality, should know that the United States is not spying on ordinary people who don't threaten our national security. And that we take their privacy concerns into account in our policies and procedures. This applies to foreign leaders as well. Given the understandable attention that this issue has received, I've made clear to the intelligence community that unless there is a compelling national security purpose, we will not monitor the communications of heads of state and government of our close friends and allies. And I've instructed my national security team, as well as the intelligence community, to work with foreign counterparts to deepen our coordination and cooperation in ways that rebuild trust going forward.
All right, let's talk about what we just heard from the president, those proposed changes and more. Joining us, our chief national security correspondent, Jim Sciutto, our national security analyst, Peter Bergen, and our chief political analyst, Gloria Borger. Some people are going to say he went far enough. Others are going to say he didn't go far enough. What's the immediate response that you're hearing?
Both of those responses. And I would also have to say that this is sort of what we've come to expect from the president, who comes out there and says, I understand this is a real problem. People have to trust their intelligence agencies to do the right thing. I understand we need a balance between liberty and our national security, but I don't want to hold all of this metadata, but by the way, I'm going to ask somebody else for the decision about just what we do with all of this large pile of information that we collect. So he raised all the problems, and it was a great speech that way. I think he did some things by executive order, but he did leave a lot of these decisions up to Congress. And as we all know, Congress can't decide what day of the week it is. So I think there are a lot of question marks out there.
Peter, let me play another clip that sort of jumped out at me in the president's remarks. It's a sensitive subject you know well. Watch this.
The program grew out of a desire to address a gap identified after 9/11. One of the 9/11 hijackers, Khalid al-Mindar, made a phone call from San Diego to a known al-Qaeda safe house in Yemen. NSA saw that call, but it could not see that the call was coming from an individual already in the United States. The telephone metadata program under Section 215 was designed to map the communications of terrorists so we can see who they may be in contact with as quickly as possible.
All right, so when you heard that, Peter, you're an expert on the subject. What did you think?
You know, the real problem in this case was this Khalid al-Mindar person the president referred to was known to be in this country by the CIA. And the real problem was not that the NSA wasn't, missed his phone calls. The real problem is the CIA didn't tell the FBI and the State Department, hey, this guy is in the country, he's got a visa to be here, he arrived here, and he was living openly. His name was listed in the San Diego phone book. So this is really a case where information sharing within the government would have actually cracked the case, not some vast information collection program.
So what do you think the president, did he make the case why they came up with this bulk collection of all these phone numbers, all these phone calls, the duration of the calls to prevent another 9/11?
I don't think that case was made because I think it's a case that can't be made. I mean, the facts show that only one very minor terrorist activity has been stopped by that program.
So far?
So far.
That doesn't mean that others can't be stopped down the road.
Yeah, it doesn't. But the fact is we've now, we're 13 years after 9/11. If you can only point to one very minor case, it's hard to make the defense you're preventing big terrorist attacks with this program.
Jim, as you listened to the president, what did you think?
Well, it's interesting on that part. There's a very interesting moment last week in the Senate Judiciary Committee hearings when the panel, the president's own intelligence reform panel, was asked that very same question. Would this prevent the next 9/11? And they said, well, no. And even going back to 9/11, that it was about information sharing. It was not about the existence of the program. But they did go on to say, and also they did not claim that up to this point that this program has prevented any terror attacks. They can't make that connection. But they did say it might someday in the future. And they make the point, we often talk about terrorists only have to be successful once. They made the point that a program like this only has to be successful once to be justified. But, there are some who aren't satisfied with that argument. Because remember, when this program was first revealed, there was a lot of talk in the administration about 50-some-odd plots. Right. Do you remember that figure? When's the last time you heard that figure?
You haven't. And I remember the president himself talking about that when this program was first revealed. You have a president who ran for office as somebody who is very, very skeptical of the surveillance state. Now he's presiding over the surveillance state, and he's clearly trying to find his own footing on this and trying to find a way to kind of balance it all. And I think he's having some difficulty. And I also believe that there's disagreement inside the administration about just how far to go on this. And I think that the president probably stopped short of where some people internally wanted him to go.
He mentioned Edward Snowden twice by name, Peter, in his remarks. Would the president be making these proposals today if Edward Snowden had never leaked all those documents?
Of course not.
Simple.
I mean, we wouldn't be sitting around this table. Without these revelations, we wouldn't be having this discussion.
So where does that put Edward Snowden in this conversation? Well, an important dialogue we're having in the United States.
Snowden broke the law, but what he did may, in part, have some public interest benefit.
Jim, you've spoken to world leaders and you've traveled all over the world. Do you think any of them, including close friends and allies of the United States, really believe the United States is going to stop listening in to their conversations?
Well, I think at least on their conversations, but not their aides and their vice presidents. He talks about dozens of world leaders here, and he made the point that, hey, listen, if I want to hear what Angela Merkel wants to thinks, I'm going to call her up on the phone.
There is a big loophole in there that they have it open if they want to do it.
There's an enormous loophole, and he also made the point very firmly saying, hey, we have the most capabilities, and I'm not going to apologize for that, and I'm not going to rein it in. He said, we're not going to do unilateral disarmament on this because we know others are doing similar kinds of spying.
I was fascinated when he said, and Peter, you'll appreciate this, Gloria, you as well, when he said, you go into the White House Situation Room, there's a reason you can't bring a cell phone or a BlackBerry or an iPhone in there because there's potential trouble.
Unless you're in Homeland, in which case they did bring their BlackBerry into the situation.
Or indeed any American government building of any note, you can't bring, phones in.
The technology is exploding. You want to make a final point?
I was just going to make a point. This was, for the shortcomings that others will point out, a fairly remarkable program. We had a president speaking in public about the most secretive aspects of the most secretive intelligence gathering programs in the U.S. and making some fairly remarkable changes. Judicial review, one we haven't talked about a lot, extending to foreign nationals legal protections that only we as American citizens have. These are remarkable things that we would not have been talking about a few months ago.
And can I just say one other thing? As we head, and I know it's early, but as we head into the presidential arena, you had Rand Paul on earlier today because he's talking, you know, he doesn't like the surveillance state. You have other Republicans who are going to say that, you know, the president is way too soft, and it's going to be it's going to be a cornerstone of the presidential campaign, I believe.
All right, guys, good discussion. Thank you. Other news we're following here today on CNN: a fast-moving wildfire threatening more homes in Southern California. Authorities say they know who's responsible for starting the fire and why it got out of control so fast. President Obama unveils a major overhaul of NSA surveillance. He outlined changes to the massive collection of phone data exposed by the NSA leaker Edward Snowden. He called for strengthening oversight of the program, a new panel of privacy advocates, and restrictions on the collection of information. He also said there would be no routine monitoring of world leaders who are allies and close friends of the United States, and a new White House official to oversee the privacy of all of this. In his speech just a little while ago, the president talked about the need to try to balance privacy and national security.
We have to make some important decisions about how to protect ourselves and sustain our leadership in the world while upholding the civil liberties and privacy protections that our ideals and our Constitution require. We need to do so not only because it is right, but because the challenges posed by threats like terrorism and proliferation and cyber attacks are not going away anytime soon. They are going to continue to be a major problem. And for our intelligence community to be effective over the long haul, we must maintain the trust of the American people and people around the world.
Well, let's get some reaction to the president's proposals. Joining us now, the co-host of CNN's Crossfire, the former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, and Democratic strategist Stephanie Cutter, who used to work in the White House for the president. So, Mr. Speaker, how did the president do?
Look, I think it was a painful speech for him, because I think he's deeply conflicted. I think all of his natural instincts are with the civil libertarians, and that was when he was a senator. I think he's now had 5 years of briefings that are terrifying, and he's trying to communicate a balance of the two. I don't particularly agree with some of the steps he's taken, and I think they're driven by polls and by political pressure. But I understand what he's trying to accomplish.
You know the president, Stephanie, well. Is he that conflicted, tormented inside, or were these sort of conflicting pressures he's under to protect national security, but also protect privacy?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it conflict, but I would say that he is the first president who's had to deal with these issues in the data-driven society that we're now living in. And he is attempting to protect the American people in two ways. There's personal security against terrorism, but also protect their privacy. And that's what we saw today, a balance of still achieving some significant national security programs. Those programs aren't going to go away. But he put in some real significant and decisive checks and balances in them to make sure the American people could trust what's happening.
You liked it?
Yes, I did.
You didn't like it?
No, look, I think her position is defensible. But
thank you.
But I think it's not going to please anybody. Okay, no real hardline civil libertarian is going to think these are enough, and nobody whose primary worry is national security is going to think these are wise. But I think it's a good starting point for a very important national debate, and my view is very different. I mean, I think three big facts that nobody wants to talk about. One, we are in an ongoing real war. And at the moment, Al-Qaeda is winning. This is not a comment on Obama. It's a comment on the last 12 years. They're winning. Our strategy hasn't worked. Two, we're going to deal with nuclear weapons in the near future, and that means we're risking cities. So compare 3,000 dead with the World Trade Center with 250,000 dead in Cincinnati. Three, there are Americans who are engaged as enemies, and we don't have today a constitutional doctrine for being permanently at war with some of your own citizens engaged on the other side. And that's going to cause, we should have a big national debate about how do we protect privacy and the nation simultaneously.
Well, that's what the president tried to start today, but go ahead.
Right. I don't think this was the end of the conversation, nor did the president want it to be the end of the conversation. And Newt, you laid out the challenges, though I don't think that Al-Qaeda is winning. I think that we've made significant strides in breaking the back of Al-Qaeda, but we're going to be dealing with terrorism as long as we're on the face of this earth.
They're not winning in terms of attacking U.S. targets,
We've been
but they are making impressive gains in Syria, in Iraq, and a whole bunch of other places in the region. It's if there's been a reemergence of Al-Qaeda.
Right, we've conquered them in some areas. They're moving elsewhere, but the back of Al-Qaeda over the last 5 or 6 years has been broken. And we've been able, you know, I hesitate to say this without knocking on wood, but we've been able to protect the American people at home. And through the use of some of these programs, prevent attacks.
You outlined some terrifying scenarios there. Who's going to launch a nuclear bomb in Cincinnati?
You have a whole range of people who hate us. Why would you think that a terrorist who is willing to drive a car bomb, or a terrorist who's willing to walk into a mall as they did in Nairobi, would reject the opportunity if they could get one?
That's the key question. Who's got the expertise to take a nuclear bomb?
Pakistan has them. The Iranians are trying very hard to get them. You're going to see continuous leakage around the world. But my deeper point is that, and I think this is an important national debate, and frankly, neither party wants to get into it. The Republicans because they want to defend the Bush record, and the Democrats because they want to defend the Obama record. But if you look at what's happening, for example, in Fallujah, I mean, there is a resurgence. And then you look at the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who's a very decent human being, a very serious professional, say, gee, we couldn't go after these guys in Benghazi because technically we're not sure they're close enough to al-Qaeda to fit the congressional resolution. I mean, you want to cry at this kind of lawyering. We are in an active war everywhere on the planet with people who tell us pretty openly every day, we would like to destroy your civilization.
We're going to have both of you stand by. We're going to continue our conversation, move on to some other subjects as well. Newt and Stephanie are here. Also, running for president in 2016 could be a risky move for the former Florida governor, Jeb Bush. That's because his mom doesn't want him to run. We're going to tell you what Barbara Bush is saying. We'll talk to our Crossfire panel about Bush and other possible 2016 contenders.